Let's open our Bibles to Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16, we officially leave that wonderful content of chapter 15 now behind us, and we move on to chapter 16. We leave specifically that parable of the prodigal son. It was just a wonderful chapter and section on the nature of God's saving grace for even the worst of the worst. But we come now to chapter 16, and Jesus now makes a significant shift in his teaching. He will now turn his gaze from the scribes and the Pharisees, but back to his disciples, and begin to now instruct on a critical issue in the Christian life. This is a difficult chapter. I'm just going to warn you right out of the gate. It's a difficult passage, but it is a needed chapter and is always needed. In fact, this is the kind of chapter that many pastors will typically gloss over. Some just altogether skip it because it's not the kind of chapter that keeps people in the seats. This is not a church growth text. And so many just tend to gloss over it, but it is upon the faithful shepherd to preach the entire counsel of God and lay it out before the people of God. And so one of the beauties of expositional preaching, which exposition is just a fancy term that means to explain, and it typically happens chapter by chapter, verse by verse, systematically making your way through portions of Scripture. But one of the beauties of expositional preaching is that you don't just get to skip things that are unpleasant or skip things that you don't want to talk about. But this is the kind of chapter that is difficult. And so we come this morning in the providence of our Lord to this text, and it is, again, a necessary topic. And because this is a chapter that will now deal with the Christian and their money. And so once again, Jesus returns to this issue, but to equip his true disciples. And before we set our minds to it, let me just read here the text for us. And we're going to take a look at verses 1 through 9. This is a section that actually goes up through verse 13, but we're just going to be in verses 1 through 9 this morning. And this is yet another parable of our Lord. And so please follow along as I read these words. Again, I'm going to read verses 1 through 13, even though we're going to be in verses 1 through 9 in particular. But let me read through verse 13 to get some of this context set before our minds. Here's what Luke records of the ministry of our Lord under the inspiration of the Spirit. He writes in chapter 16, "Now he, Jesus, was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes.' And he summoned each one of his master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. And then he said to another, 'How much do you owe?' And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourself by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is also unrighteous in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. But you cannot serve God and wealth." Well, again, we come obviously to a chapter this morning about money, and this is an entire chapter dedicated to this issue. In fact, notice right away in verse 1, he begins again with a parable involving a rich man, a manager, and this rich man's possessions. And then in verse 14, notice Luke reports that the Pharisees who were lovers of money, he says, were listening and scoffing. And then in verse 19, Jesus tells another parable about a rich man who is dressed in purple, which was a sign of royalty and wealth in this culture, and who is joyously living in splendor every day. And so again, this is a chapter about money, unambiguously. This is about possessions. This is about wealth. This is about stewardship. It's about how you view your time, your life, your pursuits, your possessions. And so this is a critical chapter that's going to force us into some self-analysis and reflection, but again, upon the state of our hearts. It's one of those chapters that does that very effective work of laying our hearts open bare, but because this is an issue that does that like no other. And so let me just say here from the outset that Jesus, as you know, he spoke on the issue of money probably more than any other issue. And Jesus was about as far from being a greedy health, wealth, and prosperity preacher as you could get. He was everything opposite of these people who were constantly seeking to get rich off the desperations of desperate people. And then, of course, he was nothing like the greedy scribes and the Pharisees, which, again, as verse 16 indicates, were in love with money. They were people for whom religious and spiritual manipulation was their game. That was their wheelhouse. In fact, in the history of the world, few things are more effective at getting a person rich than by figuring out how to play off of the emotions and the fears and the desperations of desperate people. And so there will be just a hotter hell reserved for those kinds of people. Jesus is clear about that. In fact, we'll talk about false teachers and false spiritual leaders in just a few weeks. But Jesus, understand, he was everything opposite of that kind of activity. And so he didn't talk about money because he was always trying to guilt people into loosening up their purse strings a little bit or trying to get his disciples to crack open their wallet. In fact, Jesus, again, as you know, he was the fullness of God in flesh. He is the one, as the psalmist writes, owns the cattle of 1,000 hills, and so everything that is his already. In fact, as he says in Haggai chapter 2, all the gold and all the silver of all the nations is mine. And so he needs nothing. He does not need our money. He does not need our gifts. He does not need our resources to build his church. Everything that is already his. And so Jesus talked about money because money, and hear this, please, but money is always the preeminent window into the state of a person's heart. And that's why he talked about it. He is concerned, as you know, always about the heart. And so he used money because money does not lie in that sense. Money's got an ability to reveal what it is that a person is truly loving, and therefore, of course, truly worshiping. And because, as we saw back in chapter 12, Jesus also says that where your treasure is, so also will be your what? Your heart. And so in a sense, money does not lie. Money reveals. Money tattles on the heart. In fact, again, talk is cheap. Jesus understood this. And so he was very adept at saying, so instead of merely talking or merely professing what it is that you believe, he says time and time again, let's just see. Let's just see by taking a look at what your life actually reveals. In fact, that was the essence of the Sermon on the Mount. He does this with many issues, of course, but he certainly does it with this one. What you worship is seen not in what you say, but in what you do. What you worship is seen not in what you profess, but in what you practice. And so what we saw in chapter 12 was that what you do with your money, or perhaps even what it is that you don't do with your money, that exposes just about everything. And so this is, as you're probably already feeling, a brutal topic. It can be so piercing at times, but because Jesus understood how effective it actually was in clarifying for a person the posture of their own heart in any given season of life. And so it's brutal because it's effective, and it's effective because it's accurate. In fact, I heard a statistic this week that the average person will spend more time in their life thinking about money than not thinking about money. how to keep it, how to get it, how to grow it, how to give it, how to save it, how to spend it. And so we come to a chapter this morning in which the Lord will now use what we all already know to be the tendency in our own hearts, but to teach us, to instruct us, to correct us, to rebuke us, but of course always to sanctify us. This is a chapter that is filled with warnings in many ways, but also in many ways, if you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear and the heart that will simply listen and submit and trust the word of Christ, then in many ways, this is one of the great keys to a joyful life, to a faithful life, to a fruitful life, to a content life, and all of which is hopefully employed for the sake of the kingdom. In fact, as we're going to see, and as we've already seen in this gospel, this issue has everything to do with eternity. In fact, again, the issue of money in the scriptures, time and time again, has very little to do with the here and the now, but it has everything to do with the eternal state. And because it has everything to do with the heart. And so as I read it, he begins here with yet another story in verses 1 through 9, and then he ends with 3 practical lessons in verses 10 through 13. And I tried to do this in one sermon, but I couldn't. In fact, I'm probably still going to have to do a little bit of editing on the fly. But for those of you who like structure, verses 1 through 9 are the parable. Verses 1 through 9 is the parable, and then verses 10 through 13 are the practices. The parable and the practices. And again, we're going to take a look just at the parable for this morning. And so he begins in verse 1 by setting the scene a little bit. And so notice again, if you would please, verse 1. Jesus says this, he says, "And now he," Jesus, "was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions." Now, the first observation to make before we even get into the parable is that notice he is speaking to his disciples. And so this is not directed at the scribes. This is not directed at the Pharisees, which is basically who he's been talking to since verse 2 of chapter 15. But rather now notice, this is a teaching that is for the one who follows. This is a lesson, you could say then, for the Christian. This is a lesson for the one who is professing Jesus as Lord. And so what I want to say here from the very beginning is that nothing that we're going to talk about in this chapter has anything to do with, quote, how to get saved. That is not what this is about. This is also not about, even for that matter, how to stay saved. This is not about how to get justified, in contrast and in opposition to, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church. This is not about how to attain a right standing before God as judge. This is not about how to get redeemed. This is not about how to get into the kingdom. And so obviously we're going to be talking about money. We're going to be talking about stewardship of possessions and resources. We're going to be talking a little bit about giving, those types of things in this chapter. But none of that, understand, is what saves a person. It's not like Jesus has just forgotten everything that he said in chapter 15, where he just got done teaching that a person is saved by the sovereign grace of God alone and apart from anything that they could ever do to merit it. And so this is now a teaching then, in a sense, for those who are saved. Again, he is now instructing on what it is that a true disciple ought to now do. Or to put it another way, he's revealing, in a sense, what it is that a true disciple will do. And so the key observation to make is that he is speaking, notice, to disciples, that is, those who profess to follow. In fact, remember, again, that we obey not because we're trying to become a Christian, rather we obey because we are. That is key. We do things as an overflow of love and thanksgiving to God, but because he has already purchased our redemption for us in the perfect obedience of Christ on our behalf. But what is also true is that obedience then is the necessary fruit or byproduct of one who is saved, of a genuine Christian. Obedience is necessary, but insofar as it reveals that which is true, insofar as it reveals a changed heart. There is no such thing as a Christian who just continues to live in unrepentant or unchanged sin, an unchanged life. That is foreign to the Scriptures. For as Jesus taught in Luke chapter 6, a new heart can't help but to produce a new fruit. And so true faith or true belief produces something, which of course is why James can say in James chapter 2 that the mark of true saving faith is not what you merely think within your own heart or even what it is that you profess with your own lips, but rather it is always in what your life is actually producing in an increasing kind of way. And because, again, a changed heart means changed fruit. And so while obedience is not the means of our salvation, rather it is the evidence of it. That is the key to always keep before you, especially on texts like this. And so what Jesus is now doing is he's giving yet another opportunity to us for self-examination. In fact, Paul says elsewhere to test yourself, right? Test yourself to see whether or not you're in the faith. You ask, what is that test? Well, passages like this is a test. Chapter 16 of Luke. And so this is a parable then, understand, for the professing disciple. And so he begins then with the story of a rich man and his manager. Now, this is a parable that has always created a lot of conversation because it seems like Jesus here is using faulty motives. It seems like he's using the life of an unrighteous steward, but to teach on that which is righteous, to teach on a spiritual truth. How can you use the example of unrighteousness to teach on that which is righteous? Well, this is something that he actually did rather often. And so the story here it's pretty simple. Not a lot of explanation is actually needed, but it begins here in verse 1, notice, with a rich man who had many possessions. Now, the setting here is one in which this rich man is probably some type of businessman, probably a wealthy landowner who likely had several estates, several pieces of property. In fact, he is without question here exceedingly wealthy because he needs a manager just to steward his money, steward his operations. But we also know that he's wealthy because, notice, there are people here who owe him some large debts. And so these aren't just some personal loans that he's given to some friends or some family, but rather these, understand, are business loans. And so this is some serious money. This is a wealthy businessman who's doing business with other wealthy businessmen. And so this is a man who's at the top. He's one who's issuing these loans. He's a mover and shaker. He's got wealth. He's got power. And so he holds here some very large contracts. And so this manager then, notice, is hired by him, by this rich man, but to function as a steward of just one of his operations. He's got several operations. In fact, the term manager here, it's the term oikonomos. Oikos means house, nomos means law. So put them together, he is the one who keeps law or keeps the house. And so he is, in a sense, a manager. He's a steward of this aspect of this man's business. And so the point to understand then is that none of this stuff is actually his. Rather, he's just simply been entrusted with a great responsibility to steward this man's wealth and his possessions. And he is to steward them well. And so in the cultural setting here, the rich man, in all likelihood, he's an absentee landowner. Remember, the land of Israel was an agricultural society, and so much business was involving land. It was involving estates, farming, things of that nature. And so there is an enormous amount of assets under management here. And so there needs to be a high level of trust and competency in this manager. And because this rich owner was rarely ever present, he's just spending his time traveling all over the place. He's visiting his different operations, his different pieces of property. And so this manager then is simply a steward, nothing more, nothing less. And so what happens then in the progression of the story? Well, verse 1 states, notice that word then gets back to this owner that this steward is squandering his possessions. Now, again, the manager here is what's called a oikonomos, which means he's a free man, but of some notable standing. That is to say, he is not a doulos. He is not a slave. Rather, he is a man of significant social status. In fact, he probably would have been a man of some serious white-collar skill. In fact, even to occupy this type of position, you needed to be a man that had some business savvy yourself. You needed to understand social situations rather well, and so he would have been a man then who would have been held in some high esteem and high honor in this culture. And especially because an important part of what this oikonomos does is he needs to be able to act on behalf of the owner. That is to say that he does deals, he makes contracts, he manages money, he manages the operations. He's got to have some business acumen himself. And so he essentially does this owner's bidding, but by proxy. And so in verse 1, it gets reported to the owner that this steward, notice, is a squanderer. In fact, the term here for reported, it's the term diabolo, which is the verbal form of diablos. And what is a diablos? Well, it's the term that is used in the scriptures actually to speak of the devil. He is diabolical, and so it is the term from which we get devil. And so whoever this is that reported this to the owner, he tells the owner of this manager's diabolical activity. And it's an important observation to make because the entire point here is that this manager does what he does not by incompetency, but by intentionality. These were premeditated decisions. This was intentional, but in light of knowing what it is that he ought to have done. And so this is a man with a faulty motive. And for whatever reason, he has come to believe that he's going to get away with it. He wasn't caught immediately, and so he fell into the trap that a delayed judgment or a delayed discipline was somehow indicative that there would be no final accounting of his actions. Or just to put it another way, this is a man with many assets under management that have been entrusted to him, but due to the nature of his role, he's begun to think and to act as if it somehow actually belongs to him. And so what does this rich man then do? Well, notice he acts immediately in verse 2. And so Jesus says this. He says, "And the owner called him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager.'" What is that? Clean out your desk, you're fired, right? That is exactly what that is. Simple, quick, you're done, it's over. You're no longer management. I'm going to give you some time to put together the books, but you're out of here. Now, understand that what this owner does here is a misstep. This is not good business practice. You don't pull a person into your office, tell them they're fired, and then give them 2 weeks to sort things out. If you find someone's been squandering your resources or cooking the books, you get them out of there. You don't give them time to cover their tracks. They're just going to cover everything up or even possibly create some retributive damage for you. And so you just get them out and then you hire somebody else to sort it all out, right? And so this is a situation that makes very little sense. You don't do this. But whatever the case, it doesn't really matter because this is just a made-up story. And this is not truth on how to run a business. And so the owner here, notice he fires this man. The man knows that he's got no chance of being hired back. He was a fool. He squandered. He was irresponsible. In fact, just to give you a sense of how bad this actually was, the term here in verse 1 for squander, it's actually the same term that describes the activity of the younger prodigal son back in chapter 15. And so it's not that this manager was necessarily doing anything illegal. There's no indication that he was embezzling or stealing from this owner. It's just that he was wasteful. Dia scarpizzo, he was loose with his approach. He squandered, he scattered, he didn't run a tight ship. Wrong decisions, wrong focus, wrong spending, wrong motives. In other words, he forgot that he was supposed to be acting in the interest of the owner, not in the interest of himself or what he felt was proper. And so the owner gives this man some time to go back and work up a report. That is to say, he wants him to give him an accounting. This is a mess. How to even sort this out? Go and figure out what it is that you did and then get back to me and then you're gone. And so in verse 3, the manager then enters, notice, into what's called a soliloquy. That is, notice that he just begins to talk to himself. And so what does he say? Well, he says, "And what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg." In other words, he says, I'm a white-collar guy. I can't dig holes. I don't have strength. I have no skills. I have 0 calluses on my hands. And then, of course, being a man of some high esteem, he is just way too proud to beg. And so this is a guy who's only had to use his mind his entire life. He's a man of analytical skills, probably pretty savvy with people. And so if he's going to survive, then he needs to employ strategic intellect. And so what then happens in verse 4? Well, immediately he says, notice, "I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes." Now, what is this? Well, this is just a plan for him to work himself into a new job. In fact, the phrase here of getting into people's homes, it is the idea of lodging or finding a place to stay. But beyond that, it's actually done here with the goal in this context of the parable. It's done with the goal of getting himself some face time with some important people. This is the plan. He says that if I'm ever to have a future and get myself back into some important places, then I need to get myself into the homes of some important people. And so what does he do? Well, he thinks to himself that I will contact all of my master's debtors. Who are those? Businessmen. And so what he's going to do is he's going to work his way through these debtors one by one, and then for every single one of them, he's going to renegotiate their contracts, but at a discount. This is the plan. He says, I've got a little bit of time before I'm completely out, and so he says, let's see what I can do to leverage my position. And so he says, I will go to them and I will show them how I have worked on their behalf to lessen their debt. And of course, what will that do? Well, that will then obligate them to this man, where in this honor and shame society, if you want to maintain your honor, then when someone does you a favor, then you are bound to reciprocate. And you must reciprocate. Quid pro quo, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And in this scenario, if he did this with just one guy, then there might not be any pressure from that one guy to reciprocate, because honor and shame is a communal force. But since he's going to do it one by one to all of these debtors, then if one of the debtors decides to reciprocate, then all of a sudden now every single debtor is obligated to reciprocate. You don't want to be the one looking selfish and cheap. That would be dishonorable. That would make people suspicious of you, which is something that you definitely don't want as a business person in an honor and shame society. And so this man thinks to himself, if I lower their debts, then they will feel the social pressure to honor me, return the favor. And then what is that going to produce? Well, it's going to produce his ability to basically have the pick of the crop. From which house do I want to honor? More importantly, which businessmen do I want to start a relationship with so that they might hire me? And so this is all just a game. This is just a shrewd maneuver in which he's about to create opportunity, but so that he can leverage it. And so in verse 5, he summons the master's debtors. Jesus only cites 2 of these interactions, but understand that they are representative of all the interactions. And so in verse 5, notice Jesus says this. He says that this manager summoned each one of his master's debtors and began saying to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said 100 measures of oil. That's talking about olive oil. And so this would be about 1,000 denarii, which would be roughly equivalent to about 3 years worth of wages. And so he said, so take your bill and then sit down quickly and write 50. Again, this is very clever. This is crafty. Not only does he have him do it quickly, but he then has him do it, notice, in his own handwriting, but so as to make it appear as authentically close to the original contract as possible. And then in verse 7, notice as well, he says to another, how much do you owe? And he said 100 measures of wheat, which would be the equivalent of about 10 years worth of wages. So this is a deep discount. And so he says to this man, so take your bill and write 80, which would be about 20% or 2 years worth of wages, just immediately reduced. And so this is a significant amount of money. This is no small thing. This is a serious move. And so what is he doing? Well, he's then putting all of these debtors into some serious obligation to him. What is the play? Well, he's using the master's resources or the master's money, but to accrue for himself blessing. Or to put it another way, he is leveraging that which belongs to another, but for his own benefit, his own honor, his own future. Again, this is astute. It might be unfortunate for the owner, but this is really good for him. And so what happens then in verse 8, we'll notice a very unexpected response. And so notice the time here has come for this manager to present the books. He reports to the owner what he's done. How does the owner respond? Verse 8, he says this. Notice he says, and his master praised the unrighteous manager. Well, there's a shocking twist. But he praises this manager, and then notice why? Well, because Jesus says he had acted shrewdly. So again, an odd response. This man has cost him some serious money. Not only has he squandered his possessions for his own benefit in the first place, but now he's just cost him even more money, and once again for his own selfish benefit. And so how is that praiseworthy? How is that honorable? Well, in a sense it's not, but in a sense it is. And why? How can that be? Well, because the owner understands, hear this, he understands that he's just been outwitted. He's been outplayed. He's been outmaneuvered. And so you ask, well, why doesn't he just cancel this debt, right? Why doesn't he just cancel the new debt? Why doesn't he just go back to these debtors and tell them that this manager had zero authority to change any of these bills, and so they all need to go back to what they were? Well, first of all, you can't do that from a legal perspective, and because how do you prove the previous rate of this changed bill? But second of all, in an honor and shame society, you can't look like you weren't in control. You can't look like you didn't send this manager to renegotiate. You can't lose face with these people, or nobody's going to trust you. Nobody's going to want to do business with you. There's all kinds of reasons for why you renegotiate contracts in business, and so he can't look like he wasn't behind this. And so in verse 8, the master praises the manager, not because he's happy about this, but because in a sense he understands that he's been outwitted, outplayed. In fact, this is, as one man said, this is the stuff of business. In a broken, fallen, twisted world where everyone's just out for themselves, this is the kind of praiseworthy Machiavellian maneuvering where this manager's outwitted the owner, but to secure his own future. And so this owner knows that he's been played, just a pawn, just been used for his assets. He was just a tool that's been leveraged at his own expense. No doubt the owner here has learned a lesson that when you fire somebody, you just get rid of them immediately. But nevertheless, he praises this man for his cleverness. In fact, he's probably just been reminded here as to why he hired him in the first place. This man's got some skill. And so it's not praise for his character, but praise for his cleverness. This was unrighteous, to use the term of verse 8. And so Jesus then states this in the second half of verse 8. Here's the actual point, so here's the reason for why he gives the parable in the first place. But he says, notice, so the sons of this age are shrewder in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And so what is that? What does that mean? Well, he tells a parable in which everyone would have understood the cleverness of this unrighteous man. And so he says, look, everybody schemes, everybody strategizes, everybody sits down and figures out a plan for everything in this fleeting earthly life. And so if that is the case, arguing here from the lesser to the greater, then why don't the sons of light do the same? That is to say, people of truth, the children of God, sons of righteousness who know that this world is passing and that this is not therefore their home. Put it another way, if even sinful, unrighteous people with zero conception of eternity spend so much time devising plans to meet the temporary comforts of this passing momentary life, then why don't the children of God do at least that much, knowing that everything that they do now has profound implications for eternity? In other words, Jesus doesn't tell this parable so that we might copy this man's character. He tells it so that we might copy his cleverness. If people thought and strategized and had as much ingenuity as they do for all the bread that perishes as they do for eternity, we'd be in a much better place. We'd be thinking far more biblically and far more properly. And so what does he do in verse 9? Well, he then applies the parable. Notice what he says. He says, so I say to you, so here's the application. But I say to you, make friends for yourselves. Now, this is a command. This is not a suggestion. Make friends for yourselves. How? Well, by means of the wealth of unrighteousness. That's just a reference to money. And for what purpose? Well, so that when it fails, that is your money, your stuff, they, your friends, will receive you into the eternal dwellings. Now, that is a somewhat elusive statement. But again, what is the wealth of unrighteousness? Well, that's just a reference to money, just a reference to the things that belong to this age or this existence in which unrighteousness is the dominant experience. And so it's a reference to your money. It belongs to this passing age. You will not take it with you. And so what is Jesus saying? Well, he is saying, so use your money, use your wealth, use your resources, he says, so that when it fails, that is again to say that it's going away, because every single one of us are going to die, welcome to church, and you're not going to be able to take your stuff with you, right? But when it fails, he says, and it will fail, so notice it's not if, but when. So when it fails, make certain that you used it to secure for yourself eternal friends. And what does that mean? Well, it means so employ your temporary wealth for eternal purposes. That is to say, use the stuff of this age and this life, but to benefit you in the age to come. In other words, he's talking here about gospel ministry, where the money that you give for the cause of the kingdom and for the cause of the expansion of the gospel will perhaps result in someone being able to hear the gospel because of your generosity. And so what Jesus is saying is that they will then literally rise up and praise you and greet you as a friend when you enter into the kingdom. All that temporary wealth that you gave for evangelistic purposes and gospel causes was the means by which their soul was redeemed for eternity. Literally, you financed gospel expansion. And so in the flow of the statement here, the presumption, of course, is that they evidently die before you, and so they're going to be there ready to greet you when you enter into eternity. But this is gospel ministry. It's talking about using the resources of God that he's entrusted to all of us as stewards, but for his causes, for the master's causes. And so he doesn't describe in detail who these friends are. It could be people that heard the gospel due to your generosity. It could be also people that you helped, your brothers and sisters in Christ. You employed your wealth to serve them, to help them. This was not a wealthy culture, and so in many ways they were mutually dependent on one another. But whatever the referent, the point is that whatever you do here, it will absolutely affect your eternal experience. And if you get that principle, then I think it will radically begin to change your perspective of life, your perspective of money, your perspective of your own purpose in this world as a redeemed person. In fact, let me just say at this point, just to get to the point, that people are obsessed with money, right? People love it. And so by virtue of that fact, they are obsessed with strategy. And because if you're going to make any real money in this world, then the truth is you have to plan. And so people spend an enormous amount of time thinking about money. How to earn it, how to maximize it, how to get it, how to secure it, how to spend it, how to invest it. And so people think about investments in money like all day long. If I could just do that, or if I could just get myself to this point, then I could attain that. And so life is just one long strategy session. And so people work like dogs and then spend their free time thinking about how they're going to spend that which they worked for. Or they work like a dog because they already know what they're going to do with it. They got a plan. And so people sacrifice in tremendous ways in the short term, but because of what they're hoping it's going to yield for them in the long term. It's just the principle of delayed gratification. We understand this. And so Jesus says, so if you're willing to do that for everything temporary that is going to utterly disappear on you, then why are you so slow of heart to employ at least that much cleverness for that which lasts? And so he argues again from the lesser to the greater. If this wicked man strategized for temporary friends, then how much more ought the righteous strategize for eternal friends, which is actually then a righteous motive. Where friends in this parable understand it's just a way of referencing all the benefits and all the blessings and all the relationships and all the rewards and all the opportunities that are going to come for you in eternity. And so what is the principle? Well, the principle, again, as we saw a few months ago, is that everything that you choose to keep and everything that you choose to spend on the here and the now is what you will lose, right? But everything that you give away for the cause of Christ, cause of the kingdom, all of that is actually what you keep. And understand that heaven and entrance into the kingdom is one thing, but then the rewards and the blessings of the kingdom is another. Completely different. Entrance into heaven is a function of Christ alone. But then your experience of eternity in many ways is going to be up to you. And because it will be a function of what you do here and now. That is exactly what he's teaching. In fact, it's, again, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19. This is what we looked at a couple of weeks ago. And if you're not familiar with it, you might turn there. But Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, this is the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is giving his great teaching on the promise of provision. And so we ought not to be anxious. But he speaks here much about money and the concerns of life. But in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, Jesus says this. He says, and do not, so again, this is a command that is to be obeyed. But do not, verse 19, store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroyed, where thieves break in and steal. So again, everything in this life will almost always fail you, right? Always disappoints, never delivers as promised, always fails. In fact, it is the driving principle behind Proverbs 23, and write that one down. Proverbs 23 and verses 4 and 5, and please hear this one, and because some of you perhaps probably need to. But here's what God says in Proverbs 23 and verse 4. He says, do not, hear this, do not weary yourself to gain wealth. And cease, so again, this is a command. But cease, hear this, cease from even your consideration of it. Well, based on statistics, the church is probably failing that one pretty well, right? In fact, how many will just trifle away hours thinking about investments, stocks, property, real estate, crypto? They read books. They listen to endless podcasts. They accumulate for themselves financial advisors. What is all of that? Well, it's just the consideration of wealth. It's exactly what it is. Now, we can justify it as something else, but that is what it is. In fact, the term consideration in the original, it's the idea of having a knowledge of something. It's the idea in the context of understanding how money works, putting your mind to it. And then how many of you, and just answer this question in your own heart. I told you this was going to be fun this morning. But how many of you have even wearied yourself in your constant consideration of it, and because of what it's not yet yielded for you? Always planning, always plotting, always scheming, always figuring out how to get ahead, how to set yourself up, how to enrich yourself, how to be in a place where you never have to think about money. Well, the irony in all that so-called desire to never have to worry about money is that all you ever do is think and worry about money. And so hear me now when I say this, beloved, but that is a wasted life. Let me be blunt. He says, do not weary yourself to gain wealth and cease from your consideration of it. Very simple, not hard to understand, not a lot of complexity. It's just that it's one of those that's really hard to obey, right? And it's hard to obey because we're masters of rationalization and can justify just about anything. And yet why? Why should we cease from this? Well, here's what he says in verse 5 of Proverbs 23. He says, because when you set your eyes on it, it is gone. For wealth certainly makes itself wings like an eagle and flies towards the heavens. No matter how much you have, no matter how much you get, no matter how much you come into, what happens? It always goes away. It's just never enough. Now, in a sense, it is enough, but it's enough also because it's what God has given to you right now, and in his promise within the context of Matthew chapter 6, he says he will always sustain those who are his. Now, he is not obligated to sustain those who aren't his, but he has obligated himself by grace to sustain those who are his. This is his promise. And so while it is enough, because it's what God has given to you today, it just never feels like enough, right? And so it's never enough, not because it's not actually enough, but it's just that it's not enough to fill the void. It's not enough to bring a true or lasting contentment, satisfaction. It's not enough to meet our standard of living that we've created for ourselves, in which we believe the lie that this is what constitutes happiness and joy. It's not enough because until I have a certain amount of cushion in the account, I don't feel comfortable. And so we run, we chase, we strive, we grope, but it just keeps going out before it even touches our hands, before our eyes are even on it, he says. And so it has very little to do with meeting needs, has very little to do with sustaining us, but if we're honest, it has everything to do with meeting a standard of living, especially here in the West. It has very little to do with wanting to be generous, and much to do with believing the lie that if I can just get enough into the account, then all anxiety and all fear and all worry is just going to disappear. Well, the truth of the scriptures is that no matter how much you have, those things won't disappear. Why? Well, because money always disappears. And so if your hope and your safety and your comfort is connected to the number in your bank account, then you will live in fear and worry and anxiety all of your life. Why? Because money is always going out. And that is where your hope is. You've attached your hope to something that has wings and flies away. And it's what you're trusting in, despite what we often tell ourselves. And because if you're not trusting in it, then that number could go up and down and up and down and up and down, and it wouldn't affect you one bit. Why? Because that's not where your hope is. Your hope is tied to a promise of provision. And so Jesus says, back to Matthew chapter 6, he says, so do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But, verse 20, so contrast, so here's the second command to be obeyed, but store up for yourselves, key word, do not miss that. That is critical to this text. So notice it's not store up for others, it's not even store up for God. But he says, notice the motive. He says, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. So again, what is the principle? Well, that while it is utterly impossible to keep anything in this life, the truth is you can send it on ahead. Store up for yourself treasure. And so that anything that you might choose to keep, you will ultimately lose, but anything that you give away or strategically employ for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom is what you'll ultimately keep. And so it's just a simple investment principle of delayed gratification. And again, we understand this. We do it all the time. In fact, that is why Jesus even brings it up. He understands that we do this. And so the question is, so why don't we do it then in terms of eternity? This is the question. Why is the world so much more gifted at this than the sons of light, which, again, is just a classic Jewish idiom to speak of the sons of God? Well, he knows the answer. Well, what is the answer? It is because it always comes down to the heart, right? Has to do with what we're believing, has to do with what we're trusting in, has to do with what we treasure, and therefore what we're loving. And because, again, where your treasure is, there your heart will be, fact. And so again, talk is cheap. If you want to know what you're really loving or what you're really trusting in or what you're really hoping in, just look to your bank account. Where does all your money go? Jesus is saying, what he's saying here is that every single one of us have been entrusted with a stewardship. We are managers of God's money. And by the way, the principle here extends to way beyond money to include literally everything about your life, your time, your skills, your gifts, everything. All of it is on loan to us, but to maximize the purposes of God and him entrusting it to us in the first place as the master. It's the concept of what Jesus teaches in the parable of the talents. Some invest it, some multiply it for the owner, and then others just bury it and do nothing with it, right? They don't even squander it necessarily, but it's just that they do nothing with it. But God gives to all of us different things. He gives it to us in different amounts. But the issue is not how much you have. Rather, the issue is what do we do with what we have? And so the question is, do you view your life as a stewardship? Where everything that you've been given has not been given to squander on self, but actually to fulfill a gospel mandate? And does that mean just give it all away and live like a beggar? Does that mean we're not allowed to enjoy the things of life or spend anything that we receive on ourselves? Well, again, I taught on this last year, and so if you want to know how that looks in a practical way, then go and listen to those sermons. There's also an excellent book out on that table called The Treasure Principle. I recommend that you get it. It's free. And I've even made up a study guide out there to help us guide us through some of these things. But the issue here, understand, is far beyond money. Jesus uses money because, again, money is just, it's low-hanging fruit and it's material that we can see and analyze. But this is something that applies to every aspect of our lives. How are you employing the stewardship of your life, the stewardship of your breath, your time, your skills for the sake of the kingdom? And for some Christians, they make decisions and they do things, but it's void of any real strategic thought as to how this will affect the kingdom and their usefulness for the kingdom. In fact, some of you are contemplating a decision, even right now. And much of it is wrapped up in money, security, some kind of dream or desire. And so you've got a plan. And so you're sacrificing right now in some unbelievable ways, but just so that you can get yourself into that position to where you're hoping that it'll give to you that which you're desiring. But so much time has gone by, weeks, months, years, in which you have invested so much time, so much effort, so much planning, so much strategy just to try and attain that which you're wanting. And then when you eventually get it, it's going to occupy and suck up so much more time and so much more money that you inevitably seal your own fruitlessness. And the way that we rationalize it is yeah, but it's not sinful, right? It's not sinful. Well, maybe it's not, but maybe it is. And because, again, it has to do with what you love and what you're believing. And by the way, I have no secret knowledge of anything. Let me just clear the air. I'm just talking this way because I know the nature of man. I know the nature of my own heart. I know what I can be prone to myself at times. And so I've had to learn in my own life where I can't even let my mind even go. And because if I start contemplating and analyzing and strategizing and giving my time and my thoughts and my efforts to thinking on all of these things, well, then I know that my analytical mind combined with my ambitious nature, it could get me into some bad places. And so I've had to just make some things go away. And not because I'm so disciplined and awesome and holy, but because I am so prone to wander. And so I have had to figure out in my life what I must mark and then avoid. Don't even think about it. Some people say, yeah, but you could make a lot of money in this or in that. You could set yourself up, whatever. And yeah, maybe I could, but so what? So what? At what cost? And because it always costs. And what I know for sure is that it won't make me happy, holy, or fruitful for the purposes of the kingdom, which have eternal ramifications. And so why even entertain it? And so I'm faced with the choice. What do I believe? Well, I know what I believe, but the question is, what am I going to do? Well, again, you say, it's not like pursuing those things is sin, though. And again, yeah, you're right, it's not. But I also know its power to pull and then draw away the heart. And it always happens little by little. Why do people grow so apathetic toward the things of God? They start out so hot, so zealous, but then eventually grow cold. They're once passionate, once consumed by the honor of Christ and the expansion of the gospel, but now they're just tepid. And so why? How did that happen? Well, because hear this, a love for the world has begun to creep in. And it is a creeping little devil. And you cannot love both God and the world. It is impossible. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15, love for the Father pushes out love for the world, and love for the world pushes out love for the Father. And so if you find yourself starting to grow cold, what's happening? Love for the world is creeping in. And so when you sense apathy, or you find yourself beginning to go quick to justifications, and that ought to be a warning perhaps that love for the world is beginning to slowly push out a love for Christ. In fact, I get really nervous just from a pastoral perspective when I hear of people getting significant pay raises, bonuses, new job opportunities. And again, is any of that wrong? Well, no, not inherently, not at all. And because, again, this is about the heart. But I get nervous because I know how those things can begin to pull on the heart. And I know how it always happens little by little, never overnight. And always, hear this, entered into with the best of motives. And so I'm not impressed by a higher paying job, and neither should you be. You should be nervous. And because it's not how much you have or little you have, but what you do with what you have. There are people who are unbelievably faithful who are unbelievably rich. And there are people who are unbelievably unfaithful who have almost nothing. It is not about how much you have. The number is irrelevant. But at the dangling of more, there is the temptation. And so you ask again, yeah, but what's actually wrong with it? What is sinful about money? I thought it wasn't wrong to have a lot of money. Well, again, it's not. But again, wrong question. The question is, what is your motive for wanting it, and what are you going to do with it strategically? What I like about this parable is that there are, notice, two beneficiaries to just one strategy, verse 9. Not only does this have to do with what you'll receive for yourself in the kingdom, but it also has to do with how your investment will work to benefit somebody else and for all of eternity. Now, talk about a return on investment. And so when it comes to our assets of God under management that he's entrusted us to steward well, he will expect a return on his assets entrusted to you. But what is so wonderful, if you're understanding what Jesus is saying, is that the reward of that investment then comes directly into your life, into your pocket, but for all of eternity. And so in that sense, it's just grace upon grace, right? God is not in the business of just using people and then discarding them. Rather, he is in the business of using people, but then rewarding them richly for their faithfulness. Not only has he already wonderfully saved us by grace, but then by his grace, he gives us opportunity to invest in ourselves for all of eternity. Pretty good deal. Not only does he give us the original stuff to invest, but then we get to keep the profits. And so we enter now into a challenging chapter. And so let me just end here this morning by saying what I always say, or what I'll say often. And that is that if you want to know what you're most loving, then all you have to do is ask the very simple question of what is it right now that you're most sacrificing for? And again, this goes way beyond money. This is everything in life. What are you most sacrificing for? And again, I know the ability to justify and rationalize our way out of that question like in an instant, but we do not fool God. We fool ourselves greatly at times, but we do not fool him. And so everything we're pursuing, and then everything that we might even eventually get, understand all of it is going away. It will fail. And so Jesus says, so why don't you just employ all this time and all this effort and all this strategy into something eternal, something that stays, something that is impossible to fail. Next time we come to this chapter, we're going to take a look at some practical issues of this in verses 10 through 13, but until then, all of us would be so wise just to set our minds to reflect on this principle. What is it that you're doing? What are you chasing after? What are you planning and strategizing for? What are you hoping it's going to produce? Why do you do what you do or don't do what you don't do? Or, just to put it into a simple question, what in the world are you living for? What are you living for? Are you living for the here and the now that fades and fades so unbelievably quick? Life is such a vapor, is it not? As James says, here today and gone like today. Some of you are in the latter half of your life and you keep scratching your head as to where in the world have all the years gone. The question is, are you working hard and strategizing and sacrificing because you're so utterly aware of the fact that all of us stand on the precipice of eternity? And tomorrow has not been promised? We are all hurtling toward that final day of an accounting. So until next time, may we consider our ways. May we discern as to whether or not we're being wise stewards of God's money. We got only one shot at this life and then eternity. So may we not waste it.